Hello, my friends. Welcome back to episode 3 of the Desolate Dynasty horror podcast. Today's terrifying focus will be upon the expansion of consciousness and usage of this expansion to re-enable those with negative afflictions in Sight of the Seamless by your gracious host and narrator, Joshua Clark. If asked if I had believed in the paranormal maybe 6 months ago, I would have denied it. Any wise man of science will deny the existence of anything beyond what can be scanned and recorded with one of our 5 senses. And since no amount of paranormal, be it ghosts, demons, cryptids, etc., can ever be seen, it is easy to dismiss them as delusions of a broken mind. The notion of something besides what our senses can pick up sounds purely insane. That is, of course, what I thought before I could see beyond our small, utterly minuscule plane of existence. Just as a bit of insight into my own being, I was not gifted with a flawless mind. My eyes always had issues. A genetic ailment known to degrade optic tissues was detected within my body at a young age, and all who knew of my identity of Trace Fring knew that I will never be perfect. Growing up, I had to constantly upgrade prescription glasses, as the ones I wore throughout first grade grew outdated quickly, the ones I wore in second even quicker, and so on. At first, the changes were minuscule, but by 8th grade, I had all but lost my sight. I was, however, promised a bit of what was a new emerging medical practice, gene therapy, a method of replacing existing cells inside of my optical organs, could in theory repair the anomalous genes which had been sabotaging my vision for the entirety of my young life. Given my curse, both myself and my one remaining parent agreed that this may be the optimal route. So it went. I received an implantation of cells. With the old tissue removed, the optical organ would be repaired. I always hated the thick lensed glasses I wore day by day, which continually slipped from my forehead. The notion I could be fixed and live without those was a major morale booster. I quickly signed onto the service and was to report to a certain Arch hospital within my own hometown of Farnham, Nebraska. Every alternating Thursday, the service was to start on June 17th and conclude August 26th. By that point in time, I was promised to have results far exceeding any prior reparation attempts made by any institute or medical labs in America. Skipping ahead, the service was a major success. In just over 2 weeks, we were able to undo at least the last 5 years of damage. This technique seemed to be the miracle drug for any nerve or sensory damage, quite possibly being able to undo even the corrosion of muscle tissue, maybe even be capable of creating new tissue for said muscles from scratch. The idea that the practice was first founded in my own hometown felt like pure luck. As it seemed, however, I was not the only one suffering from similar conditions. Throughout the procedures, I made contact with other subjects with various debilitations, such as constant tics, hearing loss, paralysis even some level of bone deterioration. The thought that this was all solved by one state-of-the-art technique was incredible. I had begun to grow close with a nigh-deaf girl, my age, who was receiving the procedure on her eardrums, repairing those much smaller, much more precise structures. We got to know each other in the waiting area every week, as the doctor, Dr. Grell, was only in and could complete his practice on the aforementioned alternating Thursdays. The girl, Erica, and I had exchanged phone numbers, and my father as well as hers had us gladly abide by the rules of 2 hours on the phone each week. She was a huge support for me during this endeavor, and as such, I was more than happy to stay in contact after my own trial of the procedure was completed. The remaining 10 years of substantial damage could not be repaired at the time of the end of the first couple months, so the contract was finished, and I returned to my daily life. I may not have perfect vision at this point, but I knew that further damage was impossible, and I could go about my life without fear of losing my sight. Erica also had similar luck, but with both of our procedures completed, and with no other location tying us together, as I attended a public school and her homeschooled, we had no choice but to drift. It wasn't until about 10 months ago that I had made contact with her again. I'm 22 at the time of writing this, and 21 then, and I had so conveniently gone and got drunk. This would have made a reignition of friendship, or something along those lines, a bit awkward, regardless if the occurrence had been considered normal or not. This interaction was, however, far from normal. It was in an alley, where I hobbled through on my distorted transference home. I was not sure what I was looking at first, as I entered the bent alley, turning the corner. A worse hobble than mine could be seen from a long blonde-haired woman in front of me. It wasn't the normal drunken stagger you would expect from someone who had a bit too much that night, but rather a bizarre hop stomp, as if they were being pulled and pushed ahead by unseen forces. I had the urge to turn in the opposite direction, perhaps find an alternate route, but this unidentified fiend heard as I shifted my foot on a hunk of gravel, and it froze in place. Her head turned this way and that. I took another step back, but crazed eyes met mine as she turned faster than I could perceive. She gurgled out my name in a tone that felt far from natural, and allowed an inhuman smile to stretch upon her increasingly wrinkled face. She was no older than me, so the wrinkles belated across her face and body had been another surprise to me. Again, my name had been muttered and gurgled, as the being who was an old friend hobbled towards me. I recognized my friend despite her degrading form, and due to this recognition, I could not bring myself to run without a second thought. I hadn't sobered up from my drunken haze, but I could think rationally now, even if I couldn't force myself to act upon the thoughts. She persisted until she was directly in front of me and blabbered out, "Trace, has your procedure been completed?" she queried with a joyous tone. "Have you been gifted the catalyst?" I was still in awe, stricken by the deterioration of her face, but managed to blabber out a simple no to her, at which she let her face collapse to less than a smile. "Why," she asked, "are you still walking in this perfect world if you are still imperfect?" I was even more in shock with this obscure question and its meaning. I wanted to ask her questions now. I wished to know where she had been, what has she been up to, what has defiled her to the state she permeated in now. However, I could not ask a single thing before she interrupted the line of thought with, "I can give you a gift," a mischievous grin revealing itself on her face, one no other woman or man can replicate. "I can give you an opening to a better world. I can give you all reparation you may want or need. I can promise the future even after the days to come," she promised me. Her hand shot out in front of me, motioned for me to grab it. No sooner than I did her eyes begin to bleed. "Can you hear that?" she asked with a maniacal resuscitation in her voice. "They call me by name now. Unless I am mistaken, you will be able to see them when I cannot." After the extended reintroduction, she collapsed to the floor and let a clump of hair detach itself, and I watched as an ear of all things materialized itself atop her head. I finally began to back away from the scene as her head shot back suddenly, her face to the sky. She let her mouth open, and as another ear appeared upon her right shoulder, a large fleshy mass began to emerge from her throat. More ears could be seen upon this mass, and I could only imagine what her own biomass had to have been reduced to as this totem left her throat and listened to the dark twilight above and around it. The whole while she was letting this structure project from her mouth, a putrid bile was released, coughingly into the air, which I had hardly even registered until a burning sensation positioned on my left hand alerted me of its acidic nature. Upon the center of my left hand, the flesh bubbled and fizzed with the bile, burning through the skin, and I sat for an extra stunned 5 seconds or more, as she continued to hurl up the mountain of flesh, blood, and ears. The kind of cruel irony of her death, a mountain of ears projected from a deaf girl's mouth, made me even more sick. Her knees grew soft, and they shattered as she collapsed, and another wave of acidic vomit oozed through her nose and remaining gaps in her mouth. I had begun to run as her hands hit the ground, shattering like glass as her neck snapped upwards, even more as to ensure the tower pointed disgustingly towards the heavens, as to hear something more. I was no longer hazed by the alcohol in my system, but by fear and shock. After I hobbled home and locked myself in my abode, I reflected on what just occurred. My friend, one I had gotten to know during a very emotional era in my life, had just been defiled from the inside out by a force I could not recognize. In the fray of it, she had made an offering to me, a promise that she referred to as a catalyst. What this entailed, what the catalyst did, and how she would have administered it, had been questions inside of my mind up until the morning that preceded a rough night of no sleep. My left hand had blistered, as was not a surprise, but it displayed abnormal patterns. It would have appeared to be a solid hemisphere had it not been for a solid streak of normalized flesh running along the horizontal of it. I admired the node-like rash after removing a medical bandage I had applied to it the night before after washing it out, now feared it had become infected. I had no plans this weekend, hence the reason I left myself splurged with alcohol the day prior, not that it mattered, as the hangover did not present itself that day, and thus I chose to visit a doctor about the infection. But the issue became, how do I explain this to a doctor that a close friend of mine has vomited on my hand before a monolith erupted from her stomach and digestive tract? I chose to simply say I scratched my hand upon some bit of metal or such. Why, that was my choice. I didn't come with an answer. And as such, I continued on to the Farnham Arch Hospital to discuss treatment. I was given antibiotics, but reminded I had been up to date on vaccination, so tetanus was not a possibility. They took a swab of the pus in the infected area and informed me I would be alerted first upon any revelations. I returned home, where I stayed the night once more, but desired not to return to the bar or anywhere near the ground zero of my old friend's debilitation. I kept the bandage on at most times of the night and days, only checking on the oozing mass in the morning, leaving it for my discovery upon the following 24 hours. On the 8th day, the node had begun to solidify into a solid clump instead of a hemisphere, separated by a valley. A singular fleshy mound was formed upon my hand on the 8th day, and on the 12th, it had regenerated a gash of sorts towards the horizontal vector. On the 13th, the gash had opened, revealing a quite ironically unsightly image. Upon the backside of my left hand, an eye had opened. A literal third eye betrothed itself upon my hand, and what I experienced through the 14th day can hardly be described to someone who has only their two eyes. I did not have it aligned to my other two, so when sight was enabled within the mass, on the 14th day, I since had received the gift or the catalyst, I witnessed what appeared to be a third image diverted to a different direction than that of my two traditional eyes. I had college that day, so shocked, I chose to wrap up the eye once more with a cast and continued my way to school. The day was relatively vanilla, though I felt a bizarre twisting in my arm, leading between my hand and my shoulder. I hardly bore that occurrence any mind. When I had returned home, I unwrapped the eye and attempted to experiment with it. At first, I merely positioned it upon my forehead, as any mainstream depiction of a third eye had it positioned. I took some awkward rotations with my hand, wrist, and arm, before I finally perfected the position and orientation to merely expand my vision. It was like I had a taller field of view, though the world seemed slightly off. I could not quite describe it, but the space I stood on seemed overlaid with something else. Like the time an organism obtained its second eye, I witnessed a perception more than regular depth perception. Something more was always overlaying our world. No one had ever been able to witness it. Looking back, I can only assume this is what my friend meant when she described a series of voices she could hear with her expansion of sense. I took a long time to appreciate this gift, as for a bit it seemed severely unnatural. A curse seemed more accurate from my perspective at what point of time, but I later had a change of heart. I kept my hand bound at most times, but allowed just a sliver of light to seep through into my other inhuman eye. I had begun to manage muscle control within the structure, letting the inhuman ocular organ rotate and glance about. I can hardly describe the sensation in words, since it has never been described in any way before, but I operated it with a muscular structure hardly integrated into the original. The stirring in my arm a couple days prior was, for sure, the nervous system integrating the new organ into the picture further. I learned its flow in my free time, soon learning to operate it like any other part of my body. The images revealed to me with this new overlay revealed certain people under a new light. I begun to go into public with the bound eye, a sliver of light getting through, positioned over the middle of my chest. I would focus on certain people, and above their heads was something most obscure. A three-dimensional geometry was positioned above their heads, though this geometry was indescribable. I could not see it in full contrast, as any time I begun to make it out as, say, a sphere, cube, or pyramid, it would oscillate to another of an infinite number of incomplete shapes and culmination of shapes. Each of these images above the heads of strangers would be one of three colors: red, blue, or green. I did not know the importance of each color, but with further inspection with those who bore each color, I had figured a few factors out. Those with the red color seemed to be much better spoken, more outgoing. Those of the blue seemed to be great artistically, and more creative when it came down to any kind of unique ideas. Those bearing the green crown of incomplete shapes seemed to be much better off intellectually. They did better in academic pursuits, and had many unique ideas in the STEM fields. There were, however, outliers from these three variations of people. There were quite a few without any shapes above their heads, but something more terrifying. Around them huddled small, dark gray human figures who waddled upon short legs and dragged long arms. Their heads beheld small eyes with large sockets, and I chose not to glare too long at these small daemons. Around these outlier humans, who always seemed withdrawn from crowds, but having no real academic or artistic pursuits, the small daemons ranged in a number between 1 and 5, all tending to avoid interaction with the daemons following other passerbys. I dared not approach these outliers, so all I knew of them was what I described. I feared the creatures would recognize me as seeing them, and feared what would follow my discovery by these monsters. By avoiding these people, I managed to avoid many bad predicaments revolving around these individuals: muggings, armed robberies, bar fights, etc. All were dodged by me, since I did not involve myself with those without some underlying talent. I bore witness to the loss of both talented and untalented individuals alike, by those sided with those unholy and unsightly creatures, and I thought at one instance I witnessed one of these small humanoid figures gorging itself upon some ethereal body of a flesh man. I did not let my sight dwell with me, and I dismissed it as my imagination. I realized soon that this object upon my hand was not a curse, as I feared initially, but truly a gift. Others should be given similar gifts, I thought, but placed my own enlightenment first. I took a small kitchen steak knife and begun to open a new slit in my right hand. My mind felt fogged as I did so, and I thought for a moment my hand was being controlled by that of another from the outside. Likewise, I poked a small hole in the flesh surrounding my altered ocular organ and let sludge drip from the puncture and slide into the gap on the back of my right hand. The burning behind the seams initiated once more, but I let it happen and made no attempt to wash it out. I had made no attempt to view myself in the mirror for any shapes upon my head, or beings around my legs, prior to the night of the second phase of catalyzing my gift, but witnessed none of those obscurities. There was a small gray feature upon the back of my hand, both of them now, but aside from those markings, which appeared only to be small eyes equivalent to those daemons, I saw no gifts or curses. I was without ailment from my perspective. This changed on the 7th day since catalyzing my right hand, the gift appearing to act much quicker this time, and I looked in the mirror once more. Above my head was one oscillating shape which not only contorted in structure, but in color. It appeared to blend anywhere between blue and green, preferring green over blue. I had always been above average academically, so the green was not a surprise, though my artistic blue seemed out of place. I quickly looked about my room and noticed not a single of those gray daemons, and I was immensely relieved. I found my actions swayed further and further by these new sights, but found only solace in it, as I knew mistakes were less likely with increased sensory input. I'd begun going out with cast-bound hands, poising my arms across my chest crisscrossed, letting my fingers of my right hand point to the shoulder of my left, and left fingers to my right. I witnessed much more with this expansion, noting now, within a few people who had combination of colors, had a radiant gray color within any sensory organs. I knew those were people like me. Those could be catalyzed and enlightened, but I wished to experience more before I gave my body to extend my knowledge and gift to others. I began to notice the shapes extend far past the top of the gifted's heads, and towards the heavens. Just how high I could not determine, but those with red seemed to merge into each other, those with green with each other, and those with blue into each other, as if they were all interconnected seamlessly with those who had similar gifts. Likewise, the putrid gray entities seemed interconnected. They now had foreheads that I had never before witnessed, extending past and combining at the climax. I soon realized that the very same gray extensions I bore were interconnected with the beasts, and noticed their tiny gray eyes staring past the casts I bore to hide my unique gift and make contact with the third and fourth eye I held upon my chest. I began moving my hands away from my shoulders and over my physical eyes, whilst in public instead, as I cared less what others thought, and only what my own experience was. I realized quickly that in this occasion alone, roaming with 2 eyes is better than 4, and the new eyes are better than the old. My mind felt clear, and I covered my traditional eyes, and I felt I could see more. I removed my glasses and realized by covering my old eyes with my new eyes allowed for a much clearer image. These organs laid upon my hands, gifted by a friend long since gone, allowed me to have what is equal to, in some regards, better in others, as compared to traditional ocular organs. The heavenly gift connected to the gray daemons made them less of a fear for me. I began to study those marked by such monsters, noting at once that they never directed their talentless fleshmen to harm those with the gift. Following the first 5 months of this, myself having given up on school as some education in there felt distorted or wrong, with too many of the daemons wandering the grounds, I had noticed that appeared to be cysts of some variety appearing on the opposite side of my hands, in the palms. Fast forward another month, I had noticed that it appeared to be what was considerably reminiscent of an optical nerve. It wasn't long before I knew my old eyes weren't of use to me. I feared the feeling of what must be done, dreaded it even, but knew the next phase could not begin if I did not do it. I stared myself in the bathroom mirror for a solid hour, dreading the feeling to come, the gray tendrils of new optical nerves, seeming to be excited, even moved to express so, when I acknowledged my future actions. I had gotten a stick wedged behind my eye once at a young age, Failing to notice, I ran too close to an apple tree, having a stick snapped between my eyes and the cavern around it. I knew what was to be submerged was larger than such a tiny twig, yet the pain was immense and unsettling. I worked up the courage. I pulled my finger from a clenched fist and delved it within my ocular cavity. I hooked my finger at the end to increase leverage, getting the orb firmly locked within the hook of my finger and yanking the orb out of my skull. My right eye dangled from its original position, and I witnessed my eyes oriented in 4 different directions. This was more unsettling than any prior count, as the dangling eye rotated as it swung back and forth. My left eye was next. I took the index finger of my left hand, following a lapse of pain and a spike of courage. I submerged the finger into my skull, received another optimal leverage to the ocular organ, and yanked this one. Now both original eyes dangled and spun from just outside my skull. I had gone too far to turn back, knowing I could not simply position them back and grasp them firmly with the respective hands. I immediately yanked them from my skull, causing every nerve to snap in the process, granting myself once more only 2 eyes. I collapsed and passed out from the pain, leaving the orbs laying upon the bathroom floor. Some point in that sleep, I had to have covered my 2 empty cavities, as when I awoke, I had lost use of both my arms and hands, the hands integrating themselves upon my skull in a submissive contract of permanence, a seeming promise of never again seeing the imperfect world. For the first time since my experience, I felt the desire to see the body of my old friend. I wished to thank her. I waited nightfall to complete my embark to her body, but when I arrived, someone had long since cleaned up the physical embodiment of her experience. I walked through the alley and all adjacent alleys, and saw not even a chunk of her flesh or an ear. Upon rounding a new corner, back to the original alley, she met with me once more. She had lost need of her body, ascending past the need of it, and gaining the capacity to witness the world without the respective sensory organs. She could not speak, or I could at least not hear her, as only her mouth moved, and I heard no noise. I stared her up and down, noting all abnormal features. She took up the color of those daemons prowling round town, but kept a near-perfect visible appearance of her original persona. Though she had her initial arms, she also had a pair of hands upon each ear, a new darker gray color set of ears over top of those hands, covering up the old pair. I could not make out what she was saying, though I was able to envision it perfectly with my mind's eye. I was to expand my gift, the Catalyst, to those who also bore promise. After this, my body would be discarded, and I could spend my extended life with this girl whom I knew at a younger, more important age. I returned home, where I let my hands further integrate into my skull, my internals incubate something inhuman. I awoke one day, 2 more months from the time I met once again with my old friend, and roamed a separate alley for another old friend I could give my gift to. My guts felt ready to trigger at any moment, but I knew I held the trigger for this expansion to occur for another imperfect man. I searched the alley through and through, avoiding contact with anyone marked with anything outside of the same uncatalyzed gift I had bore for all days prior to this trigger. My final sighting of another man, while I held this form of flesh, was another acquaintance I made during the procedures I'd undergone at a younger age. He had similar nodes hidden underneath his ears, revealing the incomplete perfection of his hearing. He was at the same step I had been for so much longer. I approached him, letting my bent arms flop with my approach, and greeted him in the darkness which shrouded my new eyes. He reacted as if what I said was gibberish, but as he began to turn, I fell to my knees, letting a small fraction of light behold my new form. I began to hurl like my female friend had upon giving me the gift, my bile making contact with his right arm as he held it to shield his face, and my knees shattered as I felt the distorted biomass erupt from my stomach and digestive tract. The bile splattered in all directions, and I lost all senses for what it felt to be a whole day in a limbo state, to process the tower that erupted from my mouth. My own unconsciousness shifted from this form, however, as I lost use of it. I now felt whole and corrected again. I felt my arms free while simultaneously positioned over my eyes, and moved without use of my flesh body. The traditional physics, which I had to abide by in my flesh form, could be disabled or instantiated at will. I wandered the alley, others incapable of seeing me, and the gray demons glancing at, then dismissing me, looking for my friend. I heard her voice once again, the fond memories of our childhood and contact returning to me instantly, and we reminisced upon the time of our flesh lives. We had obtained every sense once lost to us, and experienced a world separate from our traditional world. We now wondered what these strings tying each person of a particular affinity to each other, but chose to wander about them at a later date. We did, however, begin to explore the outer spaces in this new fleshless form, noting all the worlds open for our own exploration, wondering just who is outside, whom has not received this blessing Earth has received. We had yet to discover the life outside of Earth's own children, but there is still a drag from out there. My own body was clean from that alley, and my back was turned to Earth, but the string holding me to the tower of eyes which had been my body remained in the same location. If one wishes to contact me, such as others with sight, hearing, or other senses beyond what is the norm in our world, they need just walk to the location of my tower, forever stained to them with the color between yellow and green, with an oscillating shape or frequency of sound, and wish for my appearance. No matter which world outside of my own home I may be exploring with the old friends of mine, I can talk with whomever wishes to make contact in the alley between a bar and Arch Hospital in Farnham, Nebraska.